Well, Dr. Meek, it's a real treat to be here with you today. I am a big fan of your work, and I know that you have been doing interviews with other people about your work, particularly Longing to Know, which is celebrating its 20-year anniversary. And I thought, why not get an interview with the author herself? And so thank you for inviting me into your home.
Wow.
And
Thank you for
allowing
making
me
the trip
to
visit me in my home.
It was my pleasure. It's been a wonderful experience. And I'm excited to talk to you about a book that has been personally very formative for me. And what better occasion than its 20th birthday? But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what is the big question that this book seeks to address?
Well, this is a book about knowing, and in particular, knowing God. So lots of us ask that sort of question about how we would know God. And I, as a Christian believer, felt the need of asking that too. And so that's what I wrote a book about. So the book is about, it's for people considering Christianity, who have questions about knowing that are like certainty and doubt and skepticism and faith. All those are things that have to do with knowing.
So would you say this is an apologetical book?
Well, the kind of apologetics I like is, I call it disarming, which I love the double meaning of that. And I'd say this is a disarming work in what is often known as pre-evangelism. So things that you've got to address before you can really raise the question about Jesus. So in that way, the book's a response to Leslie Newbigin, who was a famous missiologist, who when he retired and came back to the West, he said something is stopping the ears of people in the West so they can't even hear the gospel. And he said what that problem is a defective understanding of knowing. So it's like he threw down the gauntlet and I wrote the book. Except I wrote the book before he threw down the gauntlet.
Amazing how that happens, right? Well, and that question, can I know God? You focus specifically. A lot of people will go to the God part of it and ask about God directly, but you think it's important to talk first about knowing.
Right, because that was my problem.
Right.
It's like I knew my Bible. I knew what I thought I was supposed to know about God. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how knowing works. And so I had to, and then when I found this innovative approach to knowing that I adopt and adapt in that book, it really changed the whole question. And for me, it was my book justifying my Christianity to myself, which I was also writing for other people. But I needed to see about my Christian faith that it was an ordinary act of knowing, like all the other knowing we're involved in every discipline and area of life. Knowing God transforms you in a life-wide sense, but it's got the same features of knowing as riding a bike or learning to read or improving your golf game, and I could go on, cooking, So
your method then is to say what we might think is a weird form of knowing God, is actually
ordinary
knowing. It's not fundamentally two different kinds of knowing.
So I thought people generally thought that things that are related to reason are over here, and faith is a different kind of not knowing. And it involved a different process. So when I started to think of the faith involved in riding a bike, then I was able to kind of align the one with the other.
Right. So your thesis is that the same defective epistemic default that we have that makes this question of knowing God a challenge is the same thing that we experience in our daily ordinary lives.
Yeah.
So you take a spiritual or a theological question and you bring it down to the very ordinary, the practical. And why do you think that that's an important thing to do? Why did you choose that method?
Well, one reason I chose it was because of the philosopher whose work I adopt, because he allowed and enabled the very thing I was looking for, which was taking philosophy into ordinary life. And kind of into the streets. And so that became kind of my gentle rebellion against the ivory tower.
Yeah.
But and then over the years, I've just gotten more and more passionate that there's one thing you need to be philosophical, and that is to have been born. And so philosophy ought to be accessible for everybody. It's for all of us. And so it involves the ordinary. And because I'm a Christian believer, the ordinary is God's creation, and it's cool. He made it stand on its own. Not that it doesn't need him, but there's a beauty about an object or a plant all on its own without his help.
Yeah.
Well, it's got his help, but it's not as if it's beautiful just for him.
Right.
There's a beauty about it.
Embedded within the thing
Yeah.
itself. Yeah, and what I really love about this approach is it's not like you're trivializing philosophy by bringing it into the streets. You're actually ennobling
Yes,
life
here.
by
Yeah.
bringing philosophy into it in really profound ways.
So, so Ralph McInerney has this quote in his intro to philosophy that it starts out like the man who woke up one day and realized he'd been speaking prose all of his life. Right? So philosophy is like that. And another reason to pay some attentiveness to it is you can't not be philosophical. So you could do it well or you could do it poorly. And, doing poorly includes not knowing what it is that you're philosophically committed to.
Right. So speaking of which, what are some of these implicit assumptions that we have about knowing and what knowing is, how knowing works that we carry around with us that you think are problematic?
All right. Well, first, let me back up and say, well, what are philosophical questions? Which I've always called the big hairy questions. So there's 4 areas. One is what is real, and the other is who am I, and then one is how I understand the real, and the other is how I'm involved in it. So the one that has to do with how I understand the real is known as epistemology. So this is a work in philosophy of knowing. But so then now I forgot what your question was.
The assumptions that we have about knowing.
Yeah, that's right. So my quest really began when I was 13, although I didn't know it at the time, but I found myself with what I call adolescent onset skepticism. And so I had 2 questions. One is, how do I know that God exists? And the other is, how do I know that anything exists beyond my mind? And the latter one seemed more of a problem. So you can see I was kind of an adolescent skeptic. Not that I told anybody. I was too embarrassed. I thought the problem was me. But then in high school, through reading the work of Francis Schaeffer, I realized that my questions were philosophical and that responses to them had shaped whole cultural disciplines epochs across the disciplines. And then it took me a couple more years to find out you could study philosophy. When I found that out, it took me 12 hours to change my life and pursue that, because one reason was not my intelligence, but I felt morally obligated because these were the most important questions. And then the other thing is I understood that philosophy connected everything. So if I ever stood a chance of getting a handle on life, it would be because I had dived down to where there's just a few questions. So,
and then you'll see the offshoots from there into every area.
Okay, but I still didn't get your to your question, which is, what are the presumptions that people in the streets have about knowing? And I would say the presumption they have is that knowledge is information. And yay, facts, data, all that kind of thing. We tend to think in bits, so factoids, disconnected. And then the goal would be certainty and also collecting all the information, so comprehensive information. And that is basically what defines what's known as the modern age, which begins with René Descartes and Francis Bacon in the 1600s and only grows more strident. And so, I mean, you could talk to any of your neighbors and ask them what they thought knowledge was, and I bet they'd say information.
It's the Wikipedia paradigm.
Yeah, and the internet, and yeah, I mean, we're in the information age.
Right.
And so we think if we've got the information, especially when we've got the bitty information of where everything comes from, then we've exhaustively explained. Or maybe the real isn't even there. It's just the information that I summarize it with.
Floating facts that I collect.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you also mentioned certainty.
Yes. Yeah. We have the ideal from our philosophical father that the only kind of knowledge that there is that counts as knowledge can't prove to be false. And if we stop and think of our lives, we know that that can't be realistic. But what it has meant is because of this kind of overweening, I'm not responsible unless I have complete certainty sort of a thing, it's made us irresponsible. And we have only one alternative, which I call it certainty or bust. So knowledge, if we had it, would be certain, but we don't have it. So because we don't have certainty.
Right. That's the criterion for.
Yeah.
If you
So
can
in
say,
Longing to Know, I got a chapter on the dangling carrot of certainty. It's a wrong-headed ideal.
The wrong thing to chase, basically.
But if you're stuck in that and you don't realize it, it wreaks havoc in your life because the only alternative is subjectivism or relativism or constructivism or
paralysis.
Right. It's not pretty.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of your main ideas, and drawing from Palani on this, is that this is not actually how we function in our everyday lives. We don't wait until we have absolute certainty before we sit in a chair or we make a new friend or anything like that.
That's right. And so I did my graduate work on this philosopher, scientist, premier scientific discoverer, Hungarian, turned philosopher, turned Englishman, Michael Palani. And discovery was his job. And he said, if knowledge is information, no scientific discovery could ever happen. But it does. What's more, it's my job, right? So how do you go from knowing nothing to knowing something? That's the thing that you need to have an account of. And so it's that account that when I read that started to address my question about whether we can know God, because it made sense of my Christianity. It also made sense of my bike riding and my cooking and my child raising and my business involvement and everything. It makes sense of everything. And you're right. The point about his approach, which I lay out chapter after chapter in Longing to Know, is I'm not teaching you something you didn't know before. This is how you can't help but know. And you're already doing it if you can play football or ride a bike or any number of skills. You're already doing it. Your whole life is full of those examples. And this is the way you live. It's just that modernity privileged the bits that you focus on and made that the paradigm. And the problem isn't information. The problem is the philosophy of idolizing focal bits. And that's what Palani said is if you fixate on the focal bits, you never come to the discovery.
Right. If I just stare at the bike and the brakes and the gears,
you're not going to ride it.
I'm not going to ride it.
Right.
I have to actually get on the bike and give myself to it in order for that to happen. We had a lovely conversation earlier about Sherlock Holmes, and you think of Sherlock Holmes as this hallmark of modern thinking and finding the clues and doing the detective work, very empirical. But if you look at the stories, he never actually discovers that way. So if you really follow the scientific method to the letter, no discovery will happen. And that's yours and Palani's point there.
Right.
Yeah.
So what my job is helping people see how Palani says that we already are going about knowing. And so it's like you relay the accents or the underscores under the things that you are already doing.
Right.
And you start to see, this is what knowing is, and it's not alien to me. This is what I do. So early on, a dermatological surgeon read the book and had me speak to his. He was a teaching doctor. He had me speak to his class because he said, "This is how I do surgery."
Wow.
And then there was a soprano voice teacher who said, "This is how I teach my students to sing." And so it went, and that's when I began to say, knowing works this way everywhere.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the effects that this book has had that you've seen, the epistemic impact, if you will, maybe even beyond the question of how do I know God?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I've taught the book, I've actually said to people, I know you want to love Jesus, but don't go spiritual on this too fast, because you want to see that this is describing how you play volleyball and work it out with that, and then bring it back to knowing God. So the driving analogy in there is that knowing God is like knowing your auto mechanic. And every little bit of this approach to knowing that I develop, I apply it to knowing my auto mechanic and then to knowing God. And so that's how every chapter goes. Now I've forgotten your question. I'm sorry.
Epistemic effects that this has had beyond.
So this, if you're combating a philosophy of a paradigm of knowledge as information, you can't write a textbook of more information. So you have to do something that's more transformative. So I think I write books that are events of transformation. And so you can be reading through Longing to Know, and especially until chapter 6, you have no idea what is going to come. And then it starts at 6 and it unfolds chapter by chapter, and it brings change in the process. So I don't know if you want me to explain subsidiary focal integration, but part of what gets transformed is you. And so in your encounter with your garden, it should be in a better place when you're done, and you should be in a better place. So there's a mutuality of encounter that goes on.
Which is a far cry from the idea of knowing as I'm a subject looking at an object, knowing about it. There's all
it's
knowing
more like
is
this
encounter.
Conversation.
You don't walk away changed. This is not just a asymmetrical kind of thing. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering what your hopes are for the next 20 years of the book. How do you see maybe new urgencies, new inflections today that maybe you didn't anticipate 20 years ago?
Inflections, that's a good word. Well, there's plenty of urgency. We really are in a different place from 20 years ago, aren't we? But because this stranglehold of modernity is only growing stronger, we're still living with that wreckage. And so people can have issues, they manifest maybe in different ways, but they still have that epistemological and philosophical component. And you can be kind of shaped by these hidden presumptions, and you haven't even identified them yet. So I figure I will never be out of a job, that because everybody's going to need, I call it epistemological therapy or philosophical therapy, because you have to do kind of like what the counselor does to make little course corrections in somebody's thinking or something like that then start to bring some sort of integrative healing. So take for example, nobody talked about false facts in 2004. Well, that we even can utter that phrase, I would say, has to do with our idea of knowledge as information disconnected from reality. So that's like total disconnect. And so all our technological prowess, present company accepted, is tends to support the idea that all we need is the information, and we can make the facts however we want, because one of the things that modernity did was eschew reality too.
Well, and you could have a fact just standing there and you have no way of really verifying is this true or is this false, because it's just this thing out in front of you.
Yeah.
So it becomes a crisis.
So one of the problems with the knowledge is information philosophy, philosophical approach, is there's no account of wisdom, for example. So if knowledge is just complete information, there's no philosophical account of what wisdom would be. And I think as a society, we have no respect for wisdom.
Yeah.
So, and you see other things like the huge anxiety level of students now. It's just disconnection from the real and disconnection from themselves.
Yeah.
Because of the foregrounding of information. Obviously, there's always more to it than that. And we don't need modernity to be sinners, but in modernity, this is part of our sin, that we need to address. So I would say there's issues today that are still related to the kind of healing that longing to know brings about.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing about that, and congratulations
Thank
on
you.
20 years
20
of
years.
this book having a great impact on a lot of people from a lot of different disciplines and a lot of different life experiences. So
Yeah.
thank you for your work.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting the questions.